Have you ever had the feeling that something is out of place, as if time itself is wrong? A strange sense that time might be more than just what we see on a clock. In certain places, that feeling is more than just a hunch. It's a terrifying reality. Get ready to dive into a story where time doesn't just stop, traps, and once you hear the ticking of the clock, there's no turning back. A group of urban explorers was always on the lookout for the next big challenge, something that no one else dared to face. It wasn't just for the adrenaline, it was the thrill of uncovering the unknown, stepping into places where others feared to tread. But this time, something different happened. An anonymous email appeared in their inbox. No name, no signature, just an address and a single phrase. Some mysteries are better left buried. Curiosity struck immediately. They researched the location and uncovered old stories, rumors buried by time, but nothing concrete. Just whispers that something dark was hidden in that house. A house that, for the more sensitive among them, seemed to be calling. As if it knew, they would be the next to set foot on its dusty floor. They decided to go. When they arrived, everything felt more sinister than anyone could have predicted. The house, perched on an isolated hill, had a strange aura, as if even the shadows were darker there. But what intrigued them the most was the absolute silence around them. Not even the wind dared to pass through that place. The decision to enter wasn't easy. There was no turning back. They knew that once inside, they would have to face whatever was waiting for them. With a mix of excitement and growing fear, they crossed the threshold. The air was dense, heavy, and with the first step, a sound echoed through the empty corridors. The ticking of a clock that seemed to mark not just time, but something far deeper and more terrifying. But the clock was nowhere in sight. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The heartbeat of each one of them synchronized with the ticking, as if the house had already seized their souls at that very moment. They had entered a place that wasn't just old but seemed to exist in its own time, a time that was already starting to affect them. And so it began. The door creaked, closing slowly behind them, as if the house itself was locking them in. The group exchanged glances, and even the bravest among them felt a chill run down their spines. The sound of the clock was constant. They still couldn't pinpoint its location. Everything in the house seemed suspended in time, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. Furniture was covered in white sheets, like frozen ghosts in silence. The air was thick, filled with the smell of old wood and mold. There was something else, a palpable sense that time didn't flow the same way here as it did outside. With every step, the ticking of the clock grew louder, echoing off the walls and deep within their minds. Then they noticed something strange. The hands on their wristwatches were stopped, frozen at the exact moment they crossed the threshold. No matter how many times they looked, time didn't advance. The ticking in the house was the only indication that time existed here. But it was a different, distorted time. As they explored the house, each room seemed like a twisted reflection of reality. Old photos, faces faded away, as if the past itself was being erased. But one thing was clear. They weren't alone. They could feel a presence, something or someone watching, waiting. And the clock's ticking grew faster, more intense, synchronized with their racing hearts. Every step took them deeper into the house and further from the reality they knew. And with each tick, the house seemed to come alive, beating off time, drawing them into a place where time didn't follow the rules they were familiar with. As they walked through the endless corridors of the house, something began to change. It wasn't just the discomfort, it was a growing realization. The place was messing with their minds. It started subtly, like a distant murmur, but soon became impossible to ignore. Memories they thought were long buried began to surface, forcing them to relive moments they would rather forget. Julia, the group's leader, was the first to feel it. She passed by an old mirror. She saw not her present self, but a younger version, trapped in a moment of deep loss he had never been able to overcome. The reflection wasn't just an image, it was as if she was there again, reliving that painful moment, hearing the same devastating words, feeling the same sharp pain. She tried to look away. The mirror seemed to hold her, forcing her to confront her past in a way she never had before. And then, one by one, the others began to experience the same thing. Dark memories, filled with regrets, anguish, and decisions that haunted their consciences, all manifesting in disturbing ways. For John, it was the sound of a knock on the door he never should have opened. For Lisa, it was the words she should never have said to someone who was no longer there. The most terrifying thing, the clock, that constant and relentless sound, seemed to know exactly which memory to awaken in each of them. With every tick, it brought forth a new scene, a new nightmare, and the house fed on their fear and pain, trapping them even deeper in its dark cycle. Clocks ticking, which had once seemed like a simple background noise, was now in sync with their deepest thoughts, as if it was the conductor of a symphony of personal torments. They were being forced to relive not just their worst moments, but to do so repeatedly, as if the house was using time against them, wrapping them in an endless cycle of pain. Despair began to settle in the group. The house, which had initially seemed like just an abandoned place, was now a prison holding them tightly with the invisible chains of time. They tried to retrace their steps, but the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, changing and distorting like a living maze. Every door they opened led to a new scene of personal terror, and there was no way out. Each of their minds was on the brink of collapse. Lisa began to mutter to herself, repeating disconnected phrases as if trying to convince herself that none of it was real. John, normally the calmest, now had wide, terrified eyes, sweating profusely, desperately trying not to look at the distorted reflections in the mirrors that appeared on every wall. The clock seemed to be everywhere at once, pulsating in their minds, driving them deeper into darkness. Then Julia, trying to maintain her sanity, proposed an idea: destroy the clock. Maybe if they could find it and break it, they could interrupt the cycle of torment and escape this nightmare. It was a faint hope, but the only one they had. Together, they began to follow the sound of the ticking, which grew louder and more insistent with every step they took. The house wasn't going to give up easily. With each attempt to get closer to the sound, the environment around them became more hostile. The walls seemed to close in. The whispers of the spirits of those previously trapped grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of desperate voices. They began to see shadows moving at the edges of their vision, figures that seemed to be watching them but disappeared when they tried to look directly at them. The tension was palpable. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder. They couldn't stop. The clock was somewhere in the house, and they had to find it before they lost all sense of reality. The only certainty they had was that time was not on their side, and with every passing second the house became more alive, more aware of their presence. As they followed the insistent sound of the clock, they stumbled into a room that seemed different from all the others. The walls were covered with dusty portraits, depicting faces of people who seemed to be pleading for help, their eyes fixed and desperate. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, and on it, an aged leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed, almost falling apart at the touch, but Julia, with trembling hands, began to leaf through them. The words written there were from another era, but the pain and despair conveyed in the lines were unmistakable. They were the accounts of people who, like them, had ventured into that house, each drawn by different reasons. But they all shared the same fate. They were trapped, captured by the clock, and forced to relive their worst moments until they lost their sanity. The diary told stories of victims who tried to escape in increasingly desperate ways. One of them, a man named Henry, claimed to have found the clock, or at least he thought so. He described how the clock pulsed like a heart, as if it was alive, feeding on their hopes and fears. But when Henry tried to destroy it, the house reacted with fury. He was sucked into what he called endless darkness. His words ended abruptly, with ink stains that looked like blood, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of his last sentence. As Julia read aloud, the group felt the weight of their choices. They were following the same path that so many others had before them, and now they knew that finding the clock didn't mean freedom, but a confrontation. And at that moment, something changed in the room. The sound of the clock, once distant, became unbearably loud, as if it was right above their heads. But when they looked around, Clock was still hidden, invisible, yet inescapable. The room seemed to close in around them. Portraits on the walls began to vibrate, and the figures within them seemed to come to life, whispering warnings that could no longer be ignored. But it was too late to turn back. Clock was close, they could feel it, and with every beat, it pulled them deeper, closer to a fate they were beginning to understand. What was coming would be far worse than any nightmare they had ever faced. The ticking of the clock was now deafening, as if each beat was reverberating inside their heads, nearly knocking them over with its force. The air in the house seemed to vibrate, dense, almost suffocating. They knew they were close, that the clock couldn't be far. And then, as if the house was responding to their desperation, a hidden door in the wall slowly creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase, descending into what seemed to be the heart of the house. With no other option, they began to descend, the steps creaking beneath their feet as if they were walking on the bones of something very old. The walls around them were narrow, almost claustrophobic, and as they descended, they could feel time distorting around them, as if they were moving through the ages, crossing centuries with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, the room opened up into a wide, dark space, illuminated only by the dim light of candles that seemed to have been burning for centuries, their flames flickering but never going out. And in the center of the room, they finally saw it, clock. But it wasn't a simple object. It was a monstrosity of black wood and metal, its gears exposed, turning in a movement that seemed to follow its own logic. The clock pulsed, almost as if it were alive, and its surface was covered with ancient symbols, runes that no one in the group recognized, that emanated a dark, oppressive energy. Julia, with trembling hands, took a step forward, hypnotized by the sight. Clock seemed to call to her, as if it knew how badly she wanted to be free of the weight of her past, offering her a dark promise. But then, something changed. The shadows in the room began to move on their own, projecting distorted figures on the walls, while voices whispered from all sides, in languages forgotten by time. The clock sped up, gears turning faster, and the sound of the ticking became a cacophony, blending with the screams of the souls trapped within. The group realized that the clock was not just a cursed object. It was a prison, a machine created to capture and consume time, fear, and the lives of those who dared to challenge it. And now, it was focused on them, eager to add new souls to its eternal collection. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own as the group stood face to face with the clock. The shadows around them grew denser, almost tangible, and the spectral voices that had been whispering now turned into agonizing screams. Hypnotized by the clock, they felt an intense cold that seemed to emanate from within, as if the essence of their lives was being drained by the wooden and metal monster before them. Cursed clock. The clock's gears, which had been turning frantically, suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the deafening sound that had preceded it. Clock seemed to be waiting, like a predator calculating its next move. Then, without warning, paralyzed by fear, they could only watch as the shadows around them materialized, wrapping around them like serpents, squeezing them until their bones began to crack under the pressure. Their eyes, once filled with determination, were now wide with pure terror as the clock started ticking again. This time, beats seemed to echo directly into their souls. Slowly absorbed by the shadows, their bodies and minds disintegrated until they became part of the darkness. Each one was drawn into an abyss within their own minds, and like a timeline, they saw the worst moments of their lives flash before their eyes. Loss, suffering, pain. Sometimes they saw themselves as young, sometimes as old, but always reliving or foreseeing moments of pure agony. Until synchronously, they all began to see images they didn't recognize. Memories that weren't their own. Memories of a time when the house was still in its prime. A happy family inhabited this space and was gifted by a secret admirer with the cursed artifact. Admired and pleased with the beautiful and expensive gift they had received, the house's once happy and vibrant inhabitants had their sanity drained along with their days in that house, which became a place of pure agony and suffering, as if they were trapped in their own home, in their own minds. After that, the memories began to rush, showing that the clock was hungry for the dark labyrinth of the human mind. With reports of disappearances, many curious people were drawn to the house, and the souls of the brave were consumed. They could see dozens of young people absorbed by the terror present in that house, until they saw a peculiar scene. An old woman entered the house, sat down in front of the clock, and stayed there, contemplating its beauty for hours and days, as if time didn't affect her, as if she was searching for answers. And as time passed, her youth was restored. The woman who had sat before the clock at about 88 years old stood up in the prime of life, her beauty and vitality restored. Then the final image appeared in their minds, the mysterious email they had received. They didn't question where it came from or who sent it, and now they were faced with the truth. The distortion of time worked in curious ways, and the clock had hidden methods of luring its victims. The woman they saw rejuvenated before the clock was its guardian, and as time passed she evolved with society, and with this peculiar strategy for such an ancient soul, she attracted this group to feed the clock's insatiable hunger for young souls. And then, as if nothing had happened, clock stopped again, and silence returned. They had become victims of the distorted time in that cursed house, lost souls devoured by the clock, which now pulsed with a faint light, almost as if it were satisfied, at least for now. Julia, the only survivor, knew she was in a cruel mental game where time was the enemy and every second could be her last. But one thing was certain: clock wouldn't stay sated for long. The room was plunged into a deathly silence, a silence that seemed to scream louder than any sound. Clock, now sated with its new acquisitions, ticked irregularly as if preparing for its next move. Julia, paralyzed by the horror of what they had just witnessed, realized she was on the brink of something terrible, something she could never have anticipated. Why was she the only one still alive? What had really happened to the others? Was her end near? These questions echoed in her mind like a whirlwind, until a voice whispered in her ear, giving her two choices: become the clock's new guardian, or relive her worst nightmares for eternity. The idea of escape, which had once seemed merely desperate, was now a race against the inevitable. Something inside Julia broke. Dark determination took hold of her, an acceptance that the only way to stop the clock was to do the unthinkable. With her eyes fixed on the monstrosity before her, Julia advanced, ignoring the warning cries of the souls trapped in that room. Each step was more difficult than the last, as if the air around her was solidifying, trying to prevent her from reaching the clock. But she pressed on, driven by a force she didn't fully understand. When she got close enough, she saw her own reflection in the clock's gleaming gears. But it wasn't just her she saw. Distorted faces of all the previous victims, including her friends, appeared briefly, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and torment. Julia knew that if she didn't act now, she would become just another among them. With a cry of pure rage and despair, she reached out, touching the cold runes that adorned the clock. The pain she felt was immediate and unbearable, as if all the time the clock had absorbed was passing through her body in an instant. But instead of pulling away, she held on tighter, her tears mixing with blood as the clock began to shake violently. Screams of the trapped souls echoed louder, a symphony of eternal torment. Julia knew there was no salvation for them. And then, in a blinding flash of light, everything stopped. The room was enveloped in absolute silence, but this time, final silence. The clock was in perfect condition, as good as new. Julia collapsed to her knees, exhausted, but still alive. She looked around, expecting to see the others. The room was empty. Everything that had happened there had been real. Now the shadows, the voices, everything had disappeared, but something was terribly wrong. When Julia tried to stand, she realized her legs wouldn't respond, and then with icy terror, she understood the truth. As long as she couldn't come to terms with what had happened and fully accept her new life, she wouldn't be able to leave that place. The terror began to erupt in her mind until she heard that whisper again, guiding her to make her final choice. And with determination, Julia spoke the words that sealed that eternal pact. I accept my fate. I accept the eternity offered to me and become the guardian of time. With this pact, I commit to feeding this cursed clock with the souls of those foolish enough to cross its path. I release the guardians who came before me and take on the burden in exchange for eternal peace, free from the torments that plague the human mind. Let time now belong to me, and may I never know the horrors that once tormented me. Sic fiat aeternum. Time hadn't stopped, it had restarted. Julia was trapped, frozen in time, her eyes open but unable to move. The house was silent, but inside, Julia knew she was now as doomed as those who had come before her. And the only thing she could hear, somewhere in the distance, was the echo of a clock that would never stop ticking, trapping her soul forever. But now, she had the power to control time and guard its secrets and mysteries. Somewhere unknown, a former guardian of the cursed clock could finally rest her body, rejuvenated countless times to carry out her mission. But her soul would be eternally condemned for the high price of escaping reality and the valley of the shadows of the human mind. If you enjoyed this story and felt the chill down your spine that only a good horror story can bring, then this is just the beginning. Here, we delve into the darkest corners of the imagination, where fear is palpable and the twists are always unexpected. If you have the courage to face the unknown, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our macabre stories. We have many more dark tales that will keep you up at night, wondering what might be lurking in the shadows. Be prepared for the next chapter of terror, if you dare. After all, time doesn't just pass, it waits, and when it finally catches up with you, it's too late to escape what it brings.